What is up, guys? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. Happy Independence Day. Hope you guys are still enjoying your day and are able to have some plans even in the midst of everything that's crazy right now. But wanted to just have a fun discussion with you. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. Sorry, I waited until 2 minutes, 2 days before the draft starts. But for those of you that are aware, or even those of you that aren't aware of the Scott Fish Bowl, it's been going on for quite some time. It is one of the premier fantasy contests. It's done for charity, and it involves basically all of the top tiered analysts and fans across the industry. It's a massive community event that is honestly one of the best times of the year. And something that I'm really excited. I did not get into the Scott Fish Bowl this year, but I am in the satellite leagues, so I do still have some skin in the game. But for those of you that are in it, or even just curious how it works, the Scott Fish Bowl has been, for one, changing a lot of the tendency to how we view like fantasy roles. Because one of the biggest niches about the Scott Fish Bowl is, in addition to just being a massive community event, it's also known for having very interesting quirks to the scoring rules. So the biggest quirk this year, going over the actual rules. So first of all, just understanding your baseline. You've got single quarterback, but it's also super flex. Two running backs, three wide receivers, tight end, and four total flex. Again, one of those can be a quarterback. So um, we'll get into why. Obviously, most of the time when you're dealing with Superflex, you're going to want to start two quarterbacks, but especially in this league, you're pretty much always going to want to start two quarterbacks. It's going to be a rare exception where you wouldn't want to, and that's definitely going to change your drafting strategy. The biggest nuance to the scoring system this year is the point minus 1 point per sack and the minus 1 point per incompletion and zero point 0.5 points for completion. So what does this mean? So in a nutshell, it means that if a quarterback is averaging 66.7% completion percentage, this will be negated. If they average anything under that, it's going to end up negatively impacting their scoring. And if they do anything over that, it's going to positively impact it. So that actually changes a wide range of outcomes for some quarterbacks that we would typically be drafting higher. It negates a lot of the Konami code running quarterback is necessary to win uh, tendencies that we typically see in fantasy football. What also helps it is the 6 point per passing touchdown and minus 4 point per interception, also minus 2 point for pick six. So it basically negates the Jameis Winstons of the world. So that is the biggest nuance this year. There's also another wrinkle as well, which they've done this in years past, but bringing it back again is the 0.5 point per first down. So it's basically a half point per reception, a half point per first down, which I've seen a lot of people push for as the more fair system than PPR. It's just not mainstream yet, and it's also really hard to project first downs. You can project receptions pretty easily based on target share, expected target volume per player, but first downs can be a little bit harder to project. We just have estimates of what it typically comes to, but so that is going to favor the running backs, as we'll get into in a second, because running backs typically see more touches than receivers, and as such, they have more opportunity to actually score first downs. And because receivers, even when they get a reception, don't guarantee to get a first down, it definitely negates some of the bonus that you see in PPR leagues for receivers. And then tight ends are tight end premium. They get an additional half point for first down and per reception. So that makes things a lot more interesting for the tight ends. No defenses, no kickers, as most good leagues are these years. It's just focused on the offense. So that's the essential things to remember here. Not going to get into the rest of this. If you're curious, just go to scottfishbowl.com. Talks about the elements of the tournament, how it works, and I mean, with over 1,400 teams, you're going to need to have a really, really, really good run if you want to end up taking down the title in week 16. And knock on wood, praying that we actually see a full 16 game season would be nice. So, uh, pull this up real quick. I need to actually put the link in the description of the individual that was able to pull this information for us. I'll get that in after the stream is over, so come back later if you want to download. You can get this database for $1. Again, all the proceeds are going to charity, but this is essentially what we need to know then to bring context to everything that we just talked about. So this is pulling in the passing, rushing, and receiving stats for quarterbacks through tight ends for, I believe, the past 20 years. So all the way back to 2000, we can observe what would these scoring settings have looked like across the league over the course of time. So I really want to focus more on 2019 just for the course of this discussion. We have some deeper dives that look a little bit into some other years, but for the sake of recency bias and for the sake of being able to quickly contextualize what all this actually means, I'm just going to filter for 2019 real quick. And then I also added two things to really help us real fast understand what's going on here. So I added a column for a point per game differential between the Scotty Fistbowl rankings and the PPR using a 6-point touchdown ranking, and just to give you a quick understanding of how many points per game different a specific player had, and then also the percentage change in total points between PPR and Scott Fistbowl, just to give us a quick overview of how these scoring settings impact. So we'll just go position by position and kind of talk about some quick observations just on the surface, and then I'm going to pivot over to a very smart individual on Twitter. We'll read some of the threads that he went down and then just kind of overall discuss what we've seen. So Lamar Jackson is kind of the exception to what I had said earlier um, in terms of running quarterbacks not really seeing a tick up. And part of the reason why that probably is as well, that is kind of getting neglected, is the -1 point per sacks. So you see guys like Kyler Murray last year actually saw a decrease of 3.3 fantasy points per game, an 18% drop in his fantasy points because of the scoring setting. And same thing for like Josh Allen, obviously Jameis Winston, dealing with a lot of the interceptions, Philip Rivers, Gardner Minshew, Daniel Jones. So some massive downgrades to some of these streaming quarterback options. And it really creates a massive tier break between some of the top guys. When you're considering this is also super flex, this is placing a pretty heavy premium on some of the top tier quarterbacks. Last year didn't really have an effect on Russell Wilson or Dak Prescott. A slight decrease for Deshaun Watson, again, probably due to the sacks. Gave a pretty good boost to Patrick Mahomes. And then Drew Brees is the main outlier to the scoring setting. I mean, I guess Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr finishing as top 10 quarterbacks is the bigger outlier just in terms of shock factor. But Drew Brees consistently year over year has been massively benefited from this system. Obviously, one of the most accurate quarterbacks year over year, which would make sense why having a scoring system where you're rewarded for a higher completion percentage. So over the past 3 years, Drew Brees has had an average of 27% boost to his fantasy points. And the last 2 years alone, as he's become more of that check down quarterback, playing closer to the line of scrimmage and not turning the ball over as much, he's been an absolute beast in these scoring settings, averaging over 25 fantasy points per game. With the addition of Emmanuel Sanders, Michael Thomas still there, Jared Cook and Alvin Kamara still there, I would be all on board with keeping Drew Brees in the elite tier of quarterbacks in the Scott Fistbowl. And unfortunately, I think everyone knows that by this point. So you're not going to be able to get him at like any kind of a discount. But just know if you haven't been paying attention to the rule changes, that's one of the biggest things to pay attention to. So guys like Drew Brees, guys like Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, guys that play closer to the line of scrimmage that don't play as risky but keep their completion percentage high, see some of the biggest boost to their fantasy production overall. There's only a few guys that actually saw an increase to their points per game. The majority of people just saw a decrease. So it's just accentuating more accurate quarterback play and less mistakes. So it limits the upside of a guy like Kyler Murray and Josh Allen, two quarterbacks that a lot of analysts are very excited for this year. Kyler Murray, mostly because of the sacks, and Josh Allen as well. But Josh Allen also, with terrible completion percentage, rode a lot of his fantasy value from his running game ability last year. It's also jumping up to 6 points per touchdown, and pass negates the bonus that rushing quarterbacks get you. Josh Allen last year with 9 rushing touchdowns gave you additional 18 fantasy points over the season for that purpose. But in leagues where it's 6 points for passing touchdowns as well, it doesn't really change anything. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. One thing I also noticed that was kind of weird, Matt Ryan kind of fits the build of a guy that would typically see a boost. Last year was a bad year for him. He had a pretty big increase in interceptions. If we look at Matt Ryan over the course of time, especially in 2018, 2016, we've kind of seen this trend for a while that he's up and down every other year. So in 2018, when he finished as the second best quarterback in PPR, he saw a 10% boost to his Scott Fishbowl points per game. So if Matt Ryan is able to regain this 2018 form, which I'm banking on in seasonal redraft leagues, I think Matt Ryan is probably the guy that ends up getting more underrated than a guy like Drew Brees that everyone knows about. I think Matt Ryan is more under the radar right now. Maybe Tom Brady as well. Last year, Tom Brady had a much lower efficiency rating than he had in years past. So if we just observe, um, even the past couple years, it hadn't really hurt him, because that's the bigger thing that we're looking at with quarterbacks right now, right? Is not necessarily guys who are getting a massive boost, but what guys are also just not getting dinged. So last year was bad for Tom Brady, but with the supporting cast that he had compared to years past, it's kind of easy to be explained away. Whereas we see even just the past 3 years, it wasn't the scoring system wasn't impacting him, and you really want to be able to hit quarterbacks that are averaging over 15 fantasy points per game. So Tom Brady going to Tampa Bay with that insane tier of weapons there. I think Tom Brady and Matt Ryan are the two quarterbacks that I'd be more interested in this kind of a league. And then the last guy we'll talk about from a quarterback perspective would be Teddy Bridgewater, for a guy that you can get late. Last year finished with number 2 in accuracy rating, just behind Drew Brees. He's going to also be that check down type guy that's going to play pretty close to the line of scrimmage for the most part. Probably shouldn't turn the ball over too much. Doesn't really give you much run game appeal, but again, considering this scoring system, that's less important. So I think Teddy Bridgewater is going to end up massively outperforming his draft position, because it really hasn't helped him all that much, at least thus far in the mock drafts that I've seen. Teddy Bridgewater is still going pretty late, so a guy I'd be happy with grabbing as my QB2 or 3 if you decide to punt on the quarterback position a little bit. But overall, probably need to grab your first quarterback within the first 2-3 rounds, I would recommend. Okay, let's talk running backs. So, first thing I noticed right away was um, this actually helps place a premium on running backs that see a lot of carries, which it also obviously it's not going to hurt running backs that are more used in the passing game, but you want running backs that are being used in both phases of the game. But it definitely helps running backs that see a really large portion of their team's carries. So obviously Derrick Henry, Chris Carson here, both seeing a 10% boost. Josh Jacobs seeing 11% boost. Where's Nick Chubb on here? Nick Chubb saw a 7% boost. Mark Ingram a 9% boost. Joe Mixon an 8% boost. Whereas guys like Alvin Kamara and Austin Eckler saw a negative impact to their fantasy points per game between the Scott Fistball and PPR. So it didn't hurt them massively. Like there's no gigantic fluctuations like we saw with quarterbacks of like negative 30, negative 40%. But you see like some of the other negatives, guys like James White, guys like Tariq Cohen. Again, this is coming back to the difference in doing a full point for reception versus half point reception, half point for first down. Not getting nearly as many first downs when they're getting more of their work in the passing game. You need to continue to see a pretty high carry count. So it places a bit more of a premium on the running backs that are going to see 200 plus carries. So keep that in mind. It doesn't completely destroy you. So like obviously Miles Sanders last year far more used in the passing game. It didn't really impact him at all. So it just ends up being a little arbitrary because we can't really project first downs. Marlon Mack as well, like a 15% boost. He had to hold 2 points per game above where he finished in PPR. So last year we saw, what was it again? We had 17 running backs to finish above 15 fantasy points per game. And as you can see, the drop off is pretty steep once you go beyond. I mean, I guess Wes Hill has had one good game. We ignore that. The drop off is pretty steep for running backs, as we'll get into in a second. So the main takeaway there is, for one, running backs are still very dominant in the scoring system, and it makes running backs like Derrick Henry, uh, Nick Chubb even a little bit more valuable. So if you are discounting them in PPR because of their lack of involvement in the passing game, it basically negates that and makes those running backs just as valuable as guys that are more involved in the passing game. Okay, let's look at wide receiver. Now, this is one of the bigger strategy points to note. Again, with the removal of half of a point per reception, but still maintaining the first downs, it impacts wide receivers at the greatest clip and pretty consistent across the board. There aren't any wide receivers that are benefiting from receiving half a point per PPR versus a full point, even with the first downs. We see Michael Thomas loses almost a 2 fantasy points per game difference, drops him from 374 to 345 fantasy points for the season. And pretty much across the board. So last year there were only, in comparison to the 17 running backs we saw, there were only 7 wide receivers that eclipsed that 15 point per game mark. But as is pretty much standard across the board, the drop off isn't as severe, it's much more smooth. So wide receiver is going to be a really important element to strategy because of the premium that's being placed on quarterback and running back. Wide receivers that you typically see going in like round 3 in standard leagues or redraft leagues are now dropping all the way to like round 4, 5, 6. So it's getting a little bit overblown, at least in the mocks that I've seen. Obviously, there's not like a standard ADP to be able to track for the Scott Fish Bowl because it's just a tournament that doesn't have any apps or infrastructure around it. So keep that in mind. Your draft could be completely different just based on the people of the room that you're in. But wide receiver is going to be the most important element that actually set people apart. As long as you can nail down some good. Okay, if you're going to win a tournament of 1,400 people, you're going to have to win at all 4 positions. So I'll rephrase that. But wide receiver is going to give you a really big advantage if you can nail this correctly. And we'll get into more of that in the strategy in a second. And then just want to real quick touch on tight end. I know I'm droning on with data, probably boring you guys, so we'll get to some more exciting stuff. Tight ends overall actually end up having about the same value, at least the top tier guys, as a wide receiver, but the depth isn't there. So obviously the drop off happens a lot quicker and a lot faster. But as a whole, the tight end premium really benefits tight ends, like 15 to 20% across the board, with some of the upper tier guys getting closer to 25% boost. Guys like Travis Kelce, George Kittle. So last year, Travis Kelce finished with 21 fantasy points per game. When you compare that to wide receivers, he would have finished as, oh, didn't do that right. He would have finished as the wide receiver too. So if you note here, just in fantasy points per game, this places like a massive boost to some of the upper echelon tight ends. So if you're not getting Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, I mean, Travis Kelce and George Kittle should probably be going within the first 7 picks in this kind of a format for that reason alone. So just bear that in mind. Anyway, want to skip over and jump over to Ryan Miller, excellent analyst over at Dynasty League Football, also a great site for Dynasty Leaguers out there. Much smarter than me at digging through the data. I just like to interpret what other people are doing and use it to build strategy around it. But he is very solid at this. He went through for the quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers and basically broke this down a bit more in detail into some usable data. So I just wanted to go over what he wrote because, again, he said it better than I, and we'll just talk about it a little bit more. So effectively, he had gone through and reclassified that data we were just looking at and shown over the course of the past 10 years, these were the highest quarterback scorers over that time. Peyton Manning with that massive year in 2013. Lamar Jackson would have finished as the fourth best quarterback in this time frame. So again, kind of placing that premium on quarterbacks that throw more touchdowns with that 6 points per touchdown. And I see Drew Brees pop up in here a lot, but Matt Ryan also here as well. Tom Brady, as we mentioned, Cam Newton going to be a little sneaky this year, and Ben Roethlisberger, obviously another guy that could very easily jump into the upper echelon of quarterbacks, assuming he's healthy, but it's a little bit of a risk in that regard. So, talks about the scoring again. Obviously, that twist with the -1 in completion, minus 5.5 per completion. And doesn't really talk about the sacks. That's something else to keep in mind as well, even though sacks can also be kind of hard to project. We know which teams have better offensive lines, which quarterbacks end up getting sacked more, so that's something we can still use. So basically, the prototypical quarterback he's describing here is you want a quarterback who can throw over 30 passing touchdowns, over 4,500 yards, and doesn't really need to be an elite rusher. So of the 270 qualifying quarterbacks since 2010, we only saw 6 with fewer wins. That's another interesting point that he made here. So in terms of game script, you want quarterbacks that actually are on winning teams. So keeping that in mind, that also structures the thought process of what kind of quarterbacks we could take. That would actually probably work against Matt Ryan in the argument that we were making before. But again, for guys like Tom Brady, Drew Brees, and even Kirk Cousins, teams that you're projecting to get a lot of wins, keeps the game script in such a way that they're not forcing as many turnovers, forcing as many incompletions, making as many risky throws. As we mentioned, the dual threat of running quarterbacks hasn't really helped them as much. He filtered a list of running backs that had, I believe this was over 500 rush yards. Yeah, over 500 rush yards over the course of the past 20 years. And as you can see, it hasn't really given them the same massive boost that you've typically seen. Obviously, Lamar Jackson with a great season, but even Cam Newton in 2015 would have finished with 100 less points than Lamar Jackson. Not something you would have typically seen in a standard league. So the scoring settings in SFBX really discount the bonus that you typically see with running quarterbacks. So as we kind of already mentioned, he looks at this then and says, well, based on Vegas win total, some of the quarterbacks that we should be looking at. Oh, I didn't mention Wentz. I do think Wentz is probably a really good target this year. Improved passing weapons with guys like Jalen Reagor, hopefully a healthy Deshaun Jackson, and Alshon Jeffrey will probably toast. But if Deshaun Jackson plays the whole season, adding Jalen Rager there and still having the tandem of Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert, and Miles Sanders, Carson Wentz has been historically a pretty accurate quarterback, so he's another guy that would fall into that realm of seeing a boost to his fantasy production. Roethlisberger is a guy I am struggling to get behind just because I really don't know how much that injury is going to affect him, but maybe it ends up keeping him from throwing the ball as widely down the field as he used to. It might actually keep his interceptions down, so it could actually turn out better for him overall. Um, do do do. That's pretty much it for quarterbacks. You guys can read this if you want. Just check out at Ryan Miller NFL. He's been posting a lot about the Scott Fispel. He mentioned he's fading Deshaun Watson. I understand that one. Losing DeAndre Hopkins is probably going to lower his touchdown total, make him rely more on the run game. Probably will lower his completion percentage. So I'm on board with fading Deshaun Watson as well. Obviously, Josh Allen. I'm not sure why he's fading Kirk Cousins. Maybe it's because the Vikings aren't as expected to win as many games this year with the downgrades that they've seen to their defense, but I'm not on board with that one. I think Kirk Cousins is a guy you can get at a discount, someone that's going to have a high completion percentage and still have decent touchdown volume. Yes, they did lose Stephon Diggs, but I think Justin Jefferson can come in and be just fine replacement. And then Jared Goff as well. Interesting name there, seeing that he was one of the guys that saw a pretty massive downgrade to his scoring last year. And with that terrible offensive line, he's probably going to get sacked a lot. So those would be the two guys that looking at who he's fading. I would kind of flip those. I wouldn't fade Kirk Cousins and I would fade Jared Goff, but pretty much on board. And then I'd add Matt Ryan and Tom Brady to his list of guys that I would target. All right, jumping over to running backs. This looks pretty familiar just based on what we've seen in standard leagues, but the running back drop off between the top tier guys to the rest has been even more accentuated in Scott Fispel. But I mean, this is pretty much what we're used to seeing even in redraft leagues. So getting your running back position right is obviously pivotal, but with the scoring settings that he had in terms of like later guys you want to look for, you want guys that are capable of both 70 targets and 90 carries, which, as he states, is not exactly easy to find with guys with later ADP, but that's the prototype that you want to think about. Guys that have the potential to hit that, maybe with an injury or. I mean, with 22 rounds, you're going to have to be drafting some pretty gross players. The player pool dries up pretty quickly once you get around 17, 18. So you're gonna have to take some deep stabs at guys with potential. Again, he talks about the scoring setting differences. You're gonna need to be able to stand out if you want to beat 1,400 people, obviously. And for those of you in the satellite leagues like me, I think it places even a little bit more premium on a running back because there is no waiver wire. Having to make sure that you hit on those guys that could potentially break out is going to be even more pivotal. Wide receivers are a little less valued in draft master type formats because they seem to have the most volatility from week to week. So you just need to nab a few guys to help smooth the curve out. But running backs, if you hit a guy that breaks out halfway through the year, like if you in the Scott Fispel last year, if you drafted like a Raheem Mostert in like the 20th round, then that was going to end up really saving your bacon towards the end of the year. So running backs have a pretty hefty premium in draft master format. Quarterbacks, obviously, just because they dry up so quickly, and again, no waiver wire. So the quarterbacks that you start the year with are the ones you have to end the year with. So really keep that in mind. Tight ends, I think you can actually take more of a committee approach. I don't think it in the draft master format it's as appropriate that you need to go after the top tier guys. Obviously, you're still going to take Kelsey or Kittle in the first round, but other than that, I'm comfortable taking like three guys and just riding them week in week out. So using their ability to flatten the curve week over week rather than having to invest. Oh, sorry guys, I didn't even notice you were commenting. So how many quarterbacks off the board by round three? That is an interesting question because again, there's not like a strict ADP. There's actually a website if you guys are curious. where you can do a mock draft that's based off of some ADP data that we have. It's called the footballworkshop.com SFB mock app, where you can pick your draft slot and see where like what things would actually look like. But what I've seen in most of the mocks I've looked at, there's typically about 6 to 8 quarterbacks that go in the first 2 rounds, and then another 4 or 5. So there's only about 12 to 14 quarterbacks that are off within the first 3 rounds. But that's going to vary, right? So this is you get one shot at this. It's not like people can enter 18 different teams. Let me see, get this to load here real quick. Website's a little slow, but they're offering it for free, so I don't mind it as much. Okay, so there's according to their ADP, there's 10 quarterbacks that are going within the first 3 rounds. Like I said, I've seen some mocks where up to like 16 quarterbacks have gone, and then I've also seen some where only 8 have gone. So probably I would venture to guess around 10 to 12 quarterbacks would be going off the board within the first 3 rounds on average. But again, you're going to have to play your draft room because there's no clear cut strategy that everyone is following because these scoring settings are so unique. Everyone's going to be throwing different darts. So play the room. If you're in a draft and you're drafting early and nobody's drafting quarterbacks, then it kind of changes your strategy up a little bit. Whereas if there's 12 quarterbacks that go within the first 2 rounds, you might have to pivot and make sure they don't completely dry up. But at the same point, that also means other guys are falling. So you're just going to have to play the draft room a little bit. But to just give you the answer to your question, you typically see about 10 to 12 quarterbacks go within the first 3 rounds. The Raheem Mostert of this year would be Carlos Hyde. That is interesting. I would rather take a guy like Anthony McFarland or Darrington Evans. But I guess Carlos Hyde is going to go so late that even that is not even late enough. So yeah, I mean, Carlos Hyde definitely could see a massive uptick in his carry count if Chris Carson ends up getting hurt again and Rashad Penny doesn't actually. Rashad Penny is actually the guy that would scare me away from Carlos Hyde because you can also get Rashad Penny for incredibly cheap, and I mean, this team still invested a first round pick in Rashad Penny. In the time that they've actually given him carries, he's looked good. So I feel like Rashad Penny might be the guy that if you're like drafting in round 21 and you're just like, I need a stab at a running back that could just break out towards the second half of the year. I feel like Rashad Penny would probably have a little bit better chance of doing that than Carlos Hyde personally. But I mean, they're both so cheap. It's worth taking a stab at one of those guys. And I mean, for the most part, running backs that you draft that late are not going to hit. But in a draft master format, you're probably better off taking wide receivers towards that part of the draft. You're really going to want to make sure you shore up running backs earlier on. So let me know if you guys have any more questions. Sorry, I just glanced over my other screen. I was like, oh, shoot, I have people asking questions. So anyway, where were we talking about running backs? So applying scoring over the past 5 seasons, we're talking about running back twos here. We still see running back twos that would have finished pretty good in terms of overall scoring. So overall takeaways, unless you find yourself getting one of the few bona fide workhorses, you need to find the same projected points no matter where you draft along the top 20 running backs, how you know what's to bet on. Again, as we mentioned before, trying to project first downs is a little bit arbitrary, but based on this data dive, we found that first down bonuses are earned every 4.7 rushes, 3.6 targets, or 2.7 receptions. So it still does favor a greater boost per touch for running backs that are getting a lot of targets. But again, running backs that like an 80 target count is high for a running back, whereas like an 80 carry count is nothing. So it's kind of counterintuitive to say that you get more first downs with targets, but the amount of targets you're going to receive is never going to be anywhere near the level of carries you get, which is why you still see a downgrade in fantasy points per game for like a running back like James White or Tariq Cohen, where you see on average maybe 100 carries or less, but closer to 80, 90 targets. It doesn't actually benefit them just based on that alone. So Let's keep going here. If a running back isn't involved in the pass game, they need to be really involved in the rushing game. That's fair as well. So if you're running back, if you're talking about like uh, maybe like a Jordan Howard is a good example, a running back that's going to be involved in the running game, but is still going to have a pretty decent split count between Matt Breida and Patrick Laird. If they're not involved in the passing game at all, that's also going to really limit their upside, as it would in any standard league overall. But not getting that passing volume is also going to impact them. So essentially, a player needs to have 150 carries to be worth anything. Um, Out of 196 running backs with less than 50 targets and under 150 carries, only Tevin Coleman finished with the top 100 overall season. So when you're targeting those late round running backs, they need to be involved in the passing game to have any chance at really outproducing their ADP is what he's getting at here. So once you get past the running backs that you're projecting to have 200 carries, that's when you start caring more about running backs that have passing game volume. So you're looking for later rounds, again, guys that have the potential for 70 plus targets and 90 plus rushes. Um, he targets a few guys here. I don't really understand, based on his logic, why he'd be targeting Austin Eckler more unless he's projecting a much higher carry count this year. I'm a bit wary of that one with the loss of Philip Rivers. I think this is going to be a more conservative offense. Tyrod Taylor runs the ball a bit more, doesn't check it down to his running back. So I don't really see Austin Eckler as a guy necessarily I understand, but Leonard Fournette makes sense. Josh Jacobs, Darius Geis makes sense. And I also don't understand why he'd be staying away from Jonathan Taylor, because I really think there's a chance that Jonathan Taylor by week 4 has completely taken over this backfield. And as we saw, we were looking before, Marlon Mack had a bonus of 2 additional fantasy points per game in the scoring format. So personally, I would not fade Jonathan Taylor. I understand Mark Ingram. With the addition of J.K. Dobbins, that could definitely eat into his workload. And if that's just a messy committee all year, that's probably not going to give you the upside that you need, unless Mark Ingram goes down. But in that case, you'd probably be better off just drafting J.K. Dobbins. Um, Players with later ADPs that Ryan Miller sees with a path of reaching 70 targets. Matt Breida, obviously, is someone you can get pretty cheap. If Jordan Howard goes down or Matt Breida just ends up being the more effective running back there, he could be a massive boost. I don't know why Cam Akers is on this list because he's going around round 4, round 5, so I wouldn't call that later ADP. Antonio Gibson is a name that gets thrown around a lot. Justin Jackson as well. So these are the kind of guys that you're going to target later. Probably less important to go after these guys in the satellite leagues, but more so in the actual Scotty Fishbowl. Um, and I understand why you'd fade Naeem Hines, James White, Damian Williams, although this was written before Cam Newton came to town, so I think that gives James White a bit more of a boost, just because that offense should actually be a bit more effective. And then let's look at wide receivers real quick. So this is the chart that I've kind of been referencing in my mind, but haven't shown you guys. The gap between quarterbacks, running backs, wide receiver, and tight ends is pretty massive over the course of time, but it flattens out. So wide receivers, after you get through the first 13, 24, is when you really start to see it. So that's where the ADP gets a little crazy this year when you see like over 20 running backs being selected before guys like DJ Moore that could easily finish as a top 10 wide receiver. Allen Robinson, I've seen go as late as the 5th round. People are so running back thirsty that they start to forget that this convergence of fantasy points starts happening once you get to the middle and bottom of like the RB2s and wide receiver twos. So you want to make sure that you hit some guys in this range, but as people are targeting running backs and quarterbacks that have a diminishing return on value, you're going to find a really a plethora of options in the wide receiver category around there, and Ryan Miller kind of gets into this a little bit as well in his strategy overall. Um, of course, you're gonna be looking for wide receivers that have a good average depth of target. You want guys that have an average depth of target for greater than 10, because obviously that would mean that they're getting a first down on the majority of the catches, assuming that they're not throwing on 3rd and 25. And then 90 plus targets is always going to be nice for a receiver. And if they have an average depth of target of less than 10, meaning they're probably not getting as many first downs, they need to be seeing an even bigger uptick in targets. So, based on historical stats, he really likes Ridley, Juju, Allen Robinson, Thielen, Robert Woods, and Keenan Allen. Totally understand all those guys for reasons that we've already mentioned. Especially because these guys are all going, at least in the mock drafts that I've seen, like fourth round and later. That's really juicy. So, as we've already mentioned, the scoring systems, wide receiver depth is invaluable to bring a dominant threat all season. Like we said, you're pretty much going to have to hit on all positions, but it makes sense to avoid wide receiver for the first 3 rounds. But then you can kind of go after them pretty heavily. Um, this was a pretty interesting chart that I noticed too, based on just like the cost of total fantasy points from just going from quarterback ones to quarterback twos, quarterback threes, wide receiver ones. The drop off in the top tier guys to the second tier is massive for quarterback, running back, and tight end, but it's much smaller for wide receivers. So there's, at least on average, a wider depth of receivers that are going to finish about the same place. But you notice too that wide receivers 13 to 24 scored more than quarterbacks and running backs at that same spot. So if you can nail down a few running backs and a quarterback that's going to finish in the top 12, hammering wide receiver is going to actually give you more of a return on value than taking a bunch of running backs that are going to end up finishing 13th and below. So if you're taking running backs from round 4 and beyond, you have to have a reason to be able to explain how they could finish at the top 12 in the position for it to make sense for you to take them over a wide receiver like DJ Chark, DJ Moore, Allen Robinson, guys that are most likely going to finish in the top 15, possibly even in the top 10. Oh, okay. So targeting a long average depth of target receiver, you should be looking for receivers getting above 100 targets. Not rocket science. If they have a shorter average depth of target, they're going to need more targets to make up for the lack of running back, or sorry, lack of first downs. But what about players who aren't protected for big roles but can plug in with injuries? Great stat in evaluating spot start potential. Ask yourself whether they could earn 6+ targets in that matchup. Um, so he just gives an example of some wide receivers that were able to jump in after some. No, let's not talk about this. Let's keep going. Looking for a Scotty Fishbowl League, winning wide receivers 250 plus points. In 1 in 32 instances, they had less than 4,000 total pass yards on the team, so it needs to be a high pass volume team. 550 projected attempts is a safe hurdle. So again, you want to target teams that are going to throw the ball a lot. Obviously, the Falcons, Lions come to mind immediately. Kansas City Chiefs, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Rams, Saints. Packers are interesting. Obviously, Adams is pretty much the only game in town there. So these are the guys that he projects at a top 6 wide receiver upside. I'm going to disagree with Allen. I don't think that the way that this team is structured this year, that they're going to see nearly the same passing volume without Philip Rivers. So I would just scratch him off the list. T.Y. Hilton is interesting to me. The addition of Philip Rivers definitely adds a wrinkle to the mix, but uh, last year the Colts had the 28th rated amount of passes, so they were very much a run first team. And then adding Jonathan Taylor in the second round doesn't really signal to me that they're trying to move away from the running game. So, but you can get T.Y. Hilton really cheap. So there's two ways of looking at that one. So effectively, there's not really, in my opinion, there's not really any reason to go after wide receiver in the first 3 rounds, especially because there's such a depth of the wide receiver 2 guys like Calvin Ridley, Cooper Kupp. I've even seen Amari Cooper go as late as the 4th round. I've seen Odell Beckham go as late as the 5th round. Guys with massive upside at the wide receiver position that are just getting completely faded in this format. Um, Wide receivers are going to be really interesting in terms of your strategy. And again, it also comes to reading the room. If quarterbacks are going later, uh, really hammering the wide receivers from rounds 4 to round 7 could end up being a really good boon to your team. But I think it's, again, a little bit less important to do so in draft master formats because you can shore up guys that have week winning potential much later in the draft. So based on whether or not you're in the Scotty Fishbowl or in the satellite leagues, probably place a little bit more or a little bit less emphasis on the wide receiver early on. But still, being able to double tap a wide receiver round 4 and round 5 and get two guys that you typically have to spend a second or a third round pick for in standard leagues is probably going to end up being the way that I go, even in the satellite leagues, and then punting wide receiver for the remainder of the draft. So, but yeah, hope you guys found this informative. And if you didn't know about the Scott Fishbowl, obviously apply for Scott Fishbowl 11 now. They do it every single year, and hopefully, as the industry continues to grow, they'll be able to continue to expand to have more and more people in this league. It's just really fun, and it's really fun to observe how it just brings everyone together, get some smack talk, get to play with some of the biggest names in the industry, and yeah. So thank you guys for joining us on the stream. If you're viewing us later on, hit me up in the comment section below. I'll come back and respond to any questions that you have. Hit that subscribe button for more content like this, and we'll see you guys later.